Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. This is the second installment of a three-part series of interviews with the extraordinary Diane Ravitch. Ms. Ravitch is an historian, lecturer, essayist, and former college professor who has spent 5 decades, count them, analyzing public education and pushing relentlessly for reforms that would help all children, not just those fortunate enough to be born into wealthy circumstances. She is the founder and president of the Network for Public Education, and she has now written a remarkable memoir titled An Education: How I Changed My Mind About Schools and Almost Everything Else. In this installment, we'll talk about Ms. Ravitch's remarkable personal story and about the ways she has changed her mind, sometimes dramatically, about the life she was leading and the things she believed. I am beyond pleased to say, Diane, welcome. Thanks for coming back.
What a pleasure. Thank you, Bob.
So you came from a large Jewish family in Houston, Texas. Your name at the time was Diane Silvers. So let's start there. What was it like growing up in your family's household in Houston in the 1940s and 50s?
Well, to begin with, it's always somewhat chaotic in a household with that many children.
How many?
We had a total of 8. I was number 3. I had an older brother, an older sister, and 5 younger siblings. And so there was always a certain level of chaos. My mother worked almost full-time. My parents owned a liquor store that was a few blocks away from our home. And so she wasn't around a lot. And we always had help, and the help were always black folk. Houston was about 300,000 people when I was growing up.
Right.
And there was this feeling of everything had to get bigger and bigger. And so they kept incorporating more and more districts into the city, and it grew to, I don't know how many millions are there now.
So not just the population, but the actual land.
Yeah, they expanded the land mass and the population, and there was this Texas attitude of everything has to be bigger,
Of course.
which I think there still is. But Houston was, as I was growing up, very segregated, and it's just the way things were. And as a kid growing up, there was a lot of freedom, not like today. I mean, I'm a grandparent now, but and I watched over my kids when they were little, and watch over my grandchildren when I'm responsible for them. But I had a lot of freedom. I would get on my bike and just take off and come home at dinner time. And I think that was true of all the others in my family.
And that's the way it was with me and my friends growing up in New Jersey.
Yeah.
Back in my case, back in the 1950s and 60s.
Well, it didn't seem unsafe. We weren't worried about shootings at schools. We didn't have shootings at schools. The thing I guess that we did have in my childhood was in school was we were worried about the atomic bomb. And so we had these drills where we would put our head under the desk.
That'll save you.
And, you know, if there's an atomic bomb, as the saying goes, Greenwich helfen won't help you. The whole school goes, everything goes. But fortunately, there were no atomic bombs, although we did drills regularly on what to do in case of an A-bomb should strike our city. But it was, my childhood was very free, and I was able to go wherever I wanted to go and meet with friends, and nobody was supervising me most of the time.
Right.
But it was fairly chaotic, I'd say, in terms of the household, because 8 personalities all off on their own journey.
So just a quick question about that. I think of Houston as extremely hot in the summertime and especially humid. And you grew up in that period without air conditioning either in the home or in the car. So what was it like? What were your evenings like? You also didn't have television. What was it like?
Television didn't arrive to Houston until I was about 12 or 13 years old. But more importantly, there was no air conditioning. And you're right, the climate was awful. It was very hot, and I always thought there were 2 seasons in Houston. One was summer, when it was very hot, and then the other was not summer, because we never had snow. I remember once there were a few flakes, and we went crazy that for 10 minutes it snowed, and nothing accumulated, needless to say. But the heat was unbearable, and we bore it because we didn't know anything else.
Right.
And nothing was air conditioned. Eventually, everything became air conditioned, and that made it possible for a city like Houston to boom, because before that, it was just unbearable, but you bore it because there was no other
didn't have an
alternative.
option, right.
And so going to sleep at night was hard because there'd be very little in the way of breeze, and all this humidity would just stay with you all day long and then all night long.
In one of the great understatements, you introduced a paragraph in your memoir with the words, "I did not have an idyllic adolescence." And then you went on to describe how you had been molested by your father. If I'm not mistaken, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you had not told this story before you wrote
No.
it in the book. Why did you decide to tell it now?
Well, it's my story, and I think for me it was cathartic to tell it. It was something that I never told anyone until I was married. I told my husband, and I think he preferred not to discuss it. And then I told my wife, and she is almost obsessed with it because she feels that I must have been damaged in some way that I don't understand. So she talks about it a good deal. But it's a traumatic.
We're gonna get to that later. But your wife is a woman named Mary
Mary.
that you met later on. But we'll
Yeah,
get
there are
to
a lot
that,
of things I never talked about until I wrote this book, and I felt that that it was time to tell the story. And I remember when the Me Too movement started, I wondered then if I should tell the story, but there was no real reason to. I didn't want to go on Twitter and say Me Too, because what was the point? So this is my Me Too moment, to say this happened to me. No one would have believed me. I'm not sure that if my mother would have believed me, but I didn't tell her because I was being protective of her. And the other thing to know about being molested, and I think every woman who has been unwillingly molested understands this, is you feel complicit. And you think, what did I do to make this happen?
Right.
It wasn't the perpetrator's fault. It's in some way where it's a shared guilt. So I felt bad about it, and I didn't want to talk about it.
Do you feel there were long-term consequences?
But there probably were that I don't understand, and I'm still figuring it out in terms of maybe a certain aloofness that I have, and I don't trust easily.
Right.
So I think that it did shape me in ways that I don't truly understand.
A final question about your time in Houston. You mentioned that it was a segregated city, that the help you had in your household would always be black. And you said in your book that you were raised, as you described it, in a racist, conservative milieu. But somehow you emerged as a liberal and as a Democrat. What do you think were the forces or the elements that converged to cause that to happen?
Well, my family was, both my parents were Democrats. They always voted Democratic. But the Democratic Party then is not the party that it is today.
Right. It was the Democratic Party of Lyndon Johnson and others.
Yes, it was Lyndon Johnson, but it was also Southern senators who were Democrats. And so there was, whoever was president or would be president held together a coalition of very conservative Southerners and urban areas in the North. And, you know, there were Democrats coming from all of the Midwestern states and the southern states, and that coalition has dissolved. But at the time I was growing up, people could be conservative Democrats, liberal Democrats, and being a liberal in Texas was not terribly liberal. Being a liberal meant you voted for Ralph Yarborough, who was a senator at that time.
I remember.
And for whoever was running for governor, because the Democrats control Texas. So they might be conservative, they might be moderate liberals, but they were all Democrats. And Lyndon Johnson was, in his time, fairly conservative. And I think I was surprised when he became president that he turned out to be as liberal as he was. Because
almost everyone was.
Yeah, I did not
Because
expect
Democrats really fought Democrats having Johnson on Jack Kennedy's ticket.
Yeah, it surprised me too, because I had followed his career and I always thought of him as a typical Texan, which was very much centrist, if not slightly to the right centrist. But that was the milieu in which I grew up, and I felt uneasy about the fact that the school was segregated, but there were no There were no marches, there was no activism. And I mentioned in the book that I learned about the Brown decision reading the newspapers. That was 1954, and I was in high school then.
That's the desegregation of the public schools.
Right. And I went to see the principal of my high school, Mr. Brandenberger, and I said to him, the Supreme Court said we shouldn't be segregated. Why are we still segregated? What are we going to do about it? And he gave me a lecture, and he said that if there were desegregation or integration, it would mean that a lot of black teachers and black principals would lose their jobs. And I thought that was a weird answer, but that was his rationale.
Right.
And in fact, the school board, we had school boards that had a lot of power, and 2 years they were sort of centrist liberals, and then the next 2 years they'd be crazy right-wing John Birch conservatives. And the John Birch conservatives, when they were in power, said never, we'll never, never integrate, we'll never desegregate. So when I got to college in 1956, the first paper I ever wrote was about the politics of education in Houston. And you might say that my interest in education started while I was being educated.
Wow. So you mentioned college. You went to Wellesley. Mm-hmm. So that was the mid-1950s. That was quite a change. There must have been quite a change from your life in Houston. So talk just a little bit about what life was like for you going to Wellesley.
Well, coming from a public school, especially a Texas public school, to Wellesley was in some ways a culture shock, because Wellesley was, and to some extent still is, very refined and very, at least in my time, very much white Protestant. And so I was started off with a couple of strikes against me. I was from a public school, and half the students were from public schools, the other half from very elite private schools, and they were so much better educated than I was. But I'm not one to be easily intimidated. So
I've noticed.
So I hung in there, and I just, most of my professors and the leaders of the college were older single women. And they were very stuffy and starchy, and I just had a lot of fun breaking rules, but never big rules, only little rules,
right,
enough to make myself a nuisance. And my friends from college all remember me as being very funny, because I always had this attitude of you know, how can we defy authority? And that's what that very stuffy atmosphere brought out in me. But I loved Wellesley in terms of the academics, because I had some wonderful teachers in high school, but in Wellesley, the standards were much higher. There was an honor code, whereas in my high school in Houston, the cheating was rampant, and you were sort of expected to I was the one who was always letting people copy from me, because I was very smart, and others who were not as smart would copy my answers. At Wellesley, there was an honor code, and nobody cheated, and so it was a very different atmosphere where academics were taken seriously. Most of my best friends were not Jewish. In fact, the predominant, as I said, it was a white Protestant atmosphere. There were probably fewer Catholics than there were Jews.
Wow.
It was really Protestant. And I just loved being there. It was a lot of fun. The other thing I have to mention is there was not a single student of color in my class.
Zero.
There was one in the class ahead of me who's now a federal judge, and one who was an author. Today, when I go back for my reunions, the classes there are close to 50% students who are Black, Hispanic, Asian.
Wow.
So it's been just a dramatic change, and I get thrilled when I see the incredible diversity of the student body and what they do for the world. So it was a great experience for me. I loved it.
We're racing through your life because we've only got half an hour, but there was so much. I recommend people read your memoir. Apart from the education aspects of it, and apart from public policies, your life itself was so interesting. I mean, I say read the memoir for that reason alone. It was pretty common in those days for women to marry quite young, and you did, coming out of Wellesley. And So you were not an exception in that sense, but you married into an exceptional family. So tell us about that.
Well, at the end of my junior year, I had an internship in Washington, D.C., and I was an intern at the Washington Post, where I met lots of interesting people, including the author Tom Wolfe, who was then a young reporter, and had a lot of experiences working at the Post. But the big thing that happened that summer was that I met Dick Ravitch. And Dick was very exciting, and I felt that this was a guy who was brilliant and headed for great things. And I'd have to say we fell in love. And by 6 months after that summer internship, we were engaged. And 2 weeks after I graduated college, in 1960, we were married. So you wouldn't, I guess you'd call it a whirlwind romance. But I have to say that at that time, in the mid-1950s, when I finished high school, a lot of my high school classmates got married then. And I was actually late to get married. I know that the age of marriage has gone higher and higher, but in the 1950s, you were considered almost on the verge of being an old maid if you finished college and weren't married yet.
Yeah, what you're describing was not that unusual at all.
Yeah.
In those days, for those who don't know, I just want to mention about Dick Ravitch. I mean, he went on to, he was a developer, came from a family of developers. He went on to be a real big shot in New York politics. He was the chairman of the MTA, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. He was lieutenant governor. He ran for mayor. So Dick Ravitch was a big deal. But anyway.
When I met him, he was just fun, and he drove a really cool Ford convertible. And I remember we went to concerts in Washington, and he loved classical music and taught me a lot. And I had a wonderful time with him. We were married for 25 years. We had 2 children. We lost 1 child, which was one of the great tragedies of my life. A little guy who died at the age of 2 of acute leukemia. And that is a disease that today is virtually cured. But at the time, there was no hope. It was a terrible time. But Dick and I had, we met lots of interesting people because he was a guy who was always interested in politics. So we went to state dinners at the White House and met all the mayors and socialized with Mayor Wagner and others who were involved in politics because he was very politically fascinated. But it was an exciting life.
His family was wealthy.
His family was wealthy. Mine was not.
Right. So you're married. You had 2 boys. You lost 1. You had 2 boys, right? And then, so you began to develop your career as a writer. It really got going after you were married. You experienced this terrible tragedy, but you persevered. You got your doctorate. But things were changing in your life over the course of the time when you were married. So what was going on? And talk a little bit about how things changed with you, either in your beliefs or how you felt about your life, whatever.
Well, I was very eager to have a career, and I didn't know what the career would be. And so I was kind of casting about, and I won't go into detail because all the details in the book about how I eventually decided that I would get a doctorate in the history of education, and my mentor was the Lawrence Kremen at Teachers College, and I got a degree from Columbia in the history of education. And then the book that I submitted as my, I guess, PhD dissertation was my first book, The Great School Wars, and it was a history of the New York City schools. And it was reviewed in the New York Times, and Albert Shanker called me, and we became friends. And so
he was the head of the teachers union.
Right, he was the head of the United Federation of Teachers at that time. And so I started having new horizons, and I began writing more frequently, moving into circles that I had never been in before, where I had my own life. And the more that I became involved in having my own life, the more there were tensions between me and my husband, because he was always, I thought of him as the center of a one-ring circus, where I was, on the sidelines helping him and giving dinner parties, where we would invite important people who were his friends. And when I started having my own life, it created problems. And he grew up in a different time. He was 5 years older than me. And in his time, the men were in control and in charge, and the women were gracious hostesses. And somehow I never fit that role.
It wasn't for you.
I was never, I tried, but I really was not a gracious hostess. And I think that he got this image from his mother, who was a very powerful woman. I write a lot about her in the book.
Right.
She was an incredibly talented and beautiful woman who was a gracious hostess. And she had all these fabulous friends who were part of the absolute social elite. And I was awed by her, but I couldn't do that for Dick, and I think that's what he expected. But I guess he was torn because he picked me. You know, he knew that I was not that kind of person. And so the tensions grew, and after we had been married 25 years, I left. And I left because I met a young woman, 10 years younger than me.
Back in the 1980s.
Yeah, in the 1980s. This was 1984. And as I said, we'd been married for 25 years, but the tensions between me and Dick had grown very strong. And I didn't want to pick up his socks. I didn't want to worry about whether the collar on his jacket was rolled correctly. I didn't want to do his laundry, et cetera, et cetera. And then I was at a conference and I met this very charming young woman who made me laugh. And I kept thinking, she's fun to be with. Dick's not fun to be with. He's just angry at me all the time because I'm not living up to his whatever ideal he has. And the end of that particular story is I left, and both of my kids were out of high school. The youngest had just finished high school and was touring in Europe after high school. The other had finished law school, and I picked up a few things and left and moved in with my new friend.
So you grew up in Texas, and you had this more or less traditional view of life. It was considered radical that as a woman you thought that you should have your own life and your own career. But nevertheless, you still were pretty normal for life in that era. And yet you fall in love with a woman. Now, this must have been kind of radical to you. What was going on in your head? And how had you felt up to that point about people who were gay, for example? And had you suspected that you might be gay?
Well, the short answer to that is I went through a long period of being very homophobic because I was very traditional. And I look back on that period and think, oh my God, what was I thinking? But I was homophobic. And then when I met Mary, I thought, she's so much fun to be with, I want to spend more time with her. Mm-hmm. And I'd go out, take the dog out for a long walk and call her from a phone booth. There are no phone booths anymore as far as I can tell. There were no cell phones. And we'd have long conversations. And occasionally we would go to theater, and I'd say to Dick, I'm going to go to theater with my friend from Brooklyn. And she was a teacher in a high school in Brooklyn. And he said, okay, fine, I have something else to do that night anyway. So over time, she and I grew closer together, and he and I became more estranged. And the point came where I had to make a decision. I couldn't do both. And that time came in, I guess it was 1985, 86. And I just picked up and left one day. But up until that time, up until I met her, I had not been particularly gay-friendly. And then my eyes were open because I realized there's a whole new world out there of people who are gay. I mean, I don't even know if I'm gay. I'd say probably I'm bisexual because I had, for a long time, a very happy marriage with Dick until I felt he became jealous of me. Mm-hmm. He didn't want me to have my own two-ring circus with one of them belonging to me and one to him. And all those tensions grew, but then I met Mary, and she was wonderful, and she was funny, and she introduced me to a whole new world. And I met women who were firefighters. I met women who were members of the police force, lots of teachers. And it was a world that I had never experienced, because I had gone not from rags to riches, but from my family
Right.
to Dick's family. And Dick's family was, everyone he knew was like him, very successful. And he also, I should add, was very liberal in his politics, and he
Right.
supported people in political life who were liberal. And we became very good friends with Bayard Rustin, and even had a concert in our home where Bayard sang a cappella.
One of the heroes of mine. I'm jealous
yeah.
of the fact that you knew Bayard Rustin.
Right. We were liberal, but he was homophobic. I was homophobic.
Right.
And then suddenly this happens. And I'm living in a gay world. I guess I straddled the two worlds. And then I moved over and to the point where I moved in with Mary, and our life was very defined by the fact that she was a teacher, she was an assistant principal in a very good high school, and she was gay. And then I said, oh, I guess I'm gay too, but I didn't want to talk about it.
Right.
I didn't want, it was like the world was shocked that I left Dick, because how could you leave a very successful guy? And I thought it was a little bit too much for me to say, not only did I leave Dick, I'm gay. No, I couldn't do that.
Right.
So I was closeted for a very long time.
You've been with Mary ever since. We've got one more
Yeah.
episode in this series of interviews.
It looks like we're in it forever.
It looks like the real deal.
Yeah.
So we're going to stop there. I've been speaking with Diane Ravitch. I'm Bob Herbert. I want to thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. And next time it will also be with Diane Ravitch.